Hello and welcome to Should You Play, our video solution to your gaming curiosity. Today we want to talk about Trinity Trigger, an action RPG set in the continent of Trinitia, where a divine proxy war rages on by means of elected god warriors fated for an epic standoff.
We have seen a renaissance of old school RPGs in recent years, and Trinity Trigger joins the likes of Octopath Traveler, the Mana series, Sea of Stars, and many others, in their efforts to modernise 90s dungeon crawlers. But nostalgia alone cannot guarantee success. This has been demonstrated a lot by a plethora of failed attempts to exploit gaming's yesteryear, primarily through re-releases and terrible remasters.
But as we patiently await the release of Visions of Mana and East 10 Nordics later this year, so excited by the way, it's a great time now to revisit some of those games from our hefty backlog. Trinity Trigger was one of those games that was in my hefty backlog and was met with average reviews when it was released in 2023 and is not a game that normally makes it onto people's radars.
But let's take a look at this love letter to Mana series fans by first summarising the plot.
This cannot be.
An epic heavenly war for dominance between the gods of order and the gods of chaos spill out into the mortal realm, resulting in gigantic divine weapons called armour being embedded in the ground that have a unique impact on the surrounding environment.
Due to this catastrophe almost destroying the world, the opposing parties agreed to select representatives to fight in their name. These nominated god warriors are accompanied by small strange creatures called triggers that have the ability to transform into various weapons for the player to wield in battle using the power of the armors. On a side note, why wasn't this game called God Warriors? That is a far more epic title than Trinity Trigger.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. It would have been so cool. God Warriors. Players follow the story of Cyan, a scavenger who routinely braves the perils of the local armour in his hometown of Woodroost in search of valuables to sell. He otherwise lives a quiet life with his non-blood related sister. He soon discovers that the mark on his eye is a telltale sign that he has been chosen to be the warrior of chaos and that his life is in danger.
Someone's trying to kill you. You need to leave this town, now.
Our hero, despite being an avatar for chaos, isn't painted as a force of evil in this setting. Instead, chaos is seen as freedom, while order is stifling and controlling. But rather than accept his cruel fate, Cyan and two companions compelled to guide him set out to defy the gods and save the world. It's a very cool premise that takes place on a grand dungeon crawling adventure across the vast continent of Trinitia.
We get to travel across diverse biomes, visiting local armours to unlock new weapons for our summonable triggers. It is quite a simple plot setup that perfectly sets the stage for the events that unfold. However, some might consider certain plot twists to be kind of predictable and trite. For example, I joked about the identity of a masked assailant, and the big reveal that it was in fact that person made me sigh and roll my eyes, since it was supposed to be a shocking revelation. It wasn't.
Even though Cyan's goal is to conduct peace negotiations with the Warrior of Order, hopefully establishing a mutual defiance of destiny, you can feel each playable character and trigger getting stronger as if preparing for the inevitability of a showdown. The story being intertwined with the combat system is what gives the narrative credence.
Grant unto Flom the form of a bow!
Admittedly, the live-action combat system feels initially uninspired, with just press X to hit and circle to roll out of the way, but things do get more intricate. You have to strategise, since each weapon has a synchro gauge that depletes and you need to wait for it to recharge again to inflict meaningful damage. You can't button bash your way through combat. Each companion has a summonable trigger creature that can transform into different weapons imbued with their elemental type after visiting armours.
Their different weapons and items can be selected from ring menus and used to bypass environmental obstacles and exploit enemy weaknesses discovered through trial and error. Battles can be entered freely with on-screen enemies rather than being transported to or confined in an arena of sorts. The player can freely toggle between characters and their various triggers weapons to suit the foe.
Sadly, the companion AI is atrocious. They will walk into environmental traps, get stuck in places and left behind, fail to switch to appropriate weapons, do not move out of the way of incoming attacks, and they will force you to exhaust all of the restoratives you have. Although this is amusing at first, after watching party members repeatedly walk into environmental hazards like cactus, spikes and other traps, it becomes quite irritating.
Trinity Trigger does have local co-op, allowing up to 2 additional players to take control of the other companions, which can remove those annoyances. But let's be honest, who here has ever or will ever play co-op Trinity Trigger? It's not really a game you think of when seeking couch co-op. If you happen to live with someone who also loves Trinity Trigger, then you are incredibly lucky because the chances of that are so slim. Co-op free player also sounds very awkward in this setting. Anyways, each weapon can either feel very powerful or completely useless depending on the enemy, since weaknesses are profoundly important in this game. If you use the wrong weapon, your damage output can be reduced to single digits or even 0, with damage points showing up in blue to signify a resistance.
On the flip side, an effective weapon can be very impactful and is signified by purple damage numbers. Furthermore, players can activate the selected weapon's weapon aura, which grants a temporary buff, such as increased damage or unlimited synchro gauge. The triangle button activates your trigger strike, which is the selected weapon's special attack, which sadly doesn't come with a fancy animation comparable to the Mystic Arts in the Tales of series, but it still feels impactful.
Finally, there is a powerful area of effect attack called Trinity Impact, which can be activated by holding down the X button and is great for clearing the area when you are being overwhelmed by enemies. You can assign different attacks to a string of 4 combos that play out with each subsequent normal attack button press. These attacks for each weapon can be leveled up by spending earned trigger power, or TP, which is basically skill points. Why it's not called trigger points, I will never understand.
To make things even more complex, Manatite is also introduced quite early in the game, and is the name of a material that can be attached to triggers to provide a variety of perks. From increasing Libra gains, the in-game currency, to increasing defense or attack, you will spend a lot of time crafting and experimenting with these. Crafting is also an important part of the game. There are lots of resources in the world that are needed to craft items, and this is often better, cheaper and easier than buying everything.
The only other thing we want to mention about the combat is the boss battles and difficulty spikes. Do not be fooled, this is not an easy game. The earlier sections are easy, but once you go further afield you will feel some obvious difficulty spikes. Exploiting enemy weaknesses becomes more essential and you can easily find yourself overwhelmed with enemies in every direction whilst innocently exploring.
Furthermore, bosses have an additional shield meter that you must remove before hit points can be reduced. This shield restores after a short period of time and must be removed again before you can inflict damage, which can be a right pain in the backside. Finally, you might stumble across a mini-boss after routinely ignoring warning signs and have your face smashed into the dirt. This brings to light one of the problems I have with the game. There is absolutely no indication whatsoever of recommended levels for areas, enemies, dungeons, quests or boss battles, so you will end up dying a lot.
Can't go 5 seconds without some monsters crashing the party, huh?
Anyways, the dynamic combat is certainly one of the game's strengths. Just make sure you always have restoratives handy since you are going to need them. Next, let's talk about the world design. The game is set in the continent of Trinity, which is separated into several unique regions of varying size and terrain. From small homely towns and woodland to grand cities and sprawling areas you can literally get lost in, Trinity Trigger wants you to experience it all. Deserts, snowy mountains, sewers, armour internals and so much more.
Exploring the world is a joy, providing you are well equipped to deal with the onslaught of enemies roaming around and have a decent sense of direction. The layout of the world kind of reminds me of Octopath Traveler, although smaller and less open world, since some areas are inaccessible until you progress. One of the great things about exploring this world is that you can discover secret paths in the environment, using visual clues that often lead to treasure or optional mini-boss fights, such as a set of discoloured trees indicating you can walk through them, or, pro tip, quicksand. You're welcome.
Like other old school RPGs, Trinity Trigger wants players to speak to everyone, read signs, pay attention to surroundings, figure things out, and find your own way around. The game doesn't have a dedicated waypoint system that you would expect to see in modern games. Instead, your waypoint only appears when you are already in the correct immediate area or building. You can see your waypoint on the world map so you know the region, but some of these areas are huge and it can be very hard to find where you are supposed to go.
Personally, I prefer this kind of gameplay. It encourages exploration and discovery. However, I can certainly understand why it might be a deterrent for some. but I am more than accustomed to not having waypoints from playing the old Zelda games. In terms of visuals, I love the game's art style. It looks like an iconic RPG from the 90s mixed with modern art. The cutscenes and dialogue skits are beautiful to watch with a hand-painted, sketched-on anime feel. It's difficult to describe. Trinity Trigger isn't looking to astound anyone with its visuals and simplistic conversation screens, but the art style for characters and their surroundings is beautiful and suits the game's overall vibe.
Dungeon crawling is a large part of this game since the inside of armors are your typical dungeon setup and access to other regions is mostly gained through traversing dungeon-like environments such as sewers and waterways. The dungeons are not difficult and they are not as high caliber as Zelda, but they are also nowhere near as bad as Tales of Berseria in terms of monotony. Trinity Trigger is somewhere in between. We'll give it the Goldilocks award for that. They are enjoyable and changes in the environment keep things fresh such as breakable walls, interactables, puzzles and new enemies.
The dungeons are very middle ground for me. They don't offer complicated layouts, but they do tend to offer something unique in its design. Armors culminate in unlocking a trigger weapon, which, of course, often comes after a boss fight, and as we mentioned before, this is where it can be challenging. But the reward of a new weapon is motivation enough to kick its ass.
So next, let's talk about the triggers themselves. Trinity Trigger isn't a monster taming game in a traditional sense, where you can go out and catch various triggers with different stats, types and abilities. Cyan has a fire trigger called Flam, and the two other companions have their own triggers with natural elemental affinities.
Basically, it's not the small creatures called triggers that you are collecting. Instead, you are collecting the many weapons that your assigned trigger can transform into. This is something I had difficulty getting my head around. Who can summon triggers and who can't is unclear, but what is clear is that triggers need to visit altars that correspond to their own element inside armours to gain the ability to transform into a new weapon. I do really like this setup, but part of me longs for a creature taming element to the game. The few triggers we meet are so adorable and interesting, but our inability to delve deeper into this aspect of the world is a little frustrating. I want to know more about them. I want to be able to choose my own trigger and what element each character in my party is assigned with. It's in this area that the game feels extremely lacking. This is surprising considering how large a role the triggers play in this game. Such a missed opportunity.
The only thing left that we want to talk about is the characters that make up our heroic triad. There's Cyan and his fire trigger Flam, who kinda looks like Pachirisu, Elise and her bird-like water trigger Ois, and Xantis with his electric dragoness trigger called Rai, who reminds me of Spyro the Dragon from the annoying Skylander years.
That's me! Rai's the name. Am to meet ya.
Ugh, I know, right?
Oh, that never happened. That never happened. Cyan is quite a normal dude considering his macro destiny, but it's quite common in these kind of games for fate to wreck the quiet life of the main protagonist. He is likeable, relatable, and is portrayed as a capable scavenger who faces the dangers of the armour to find things to sell to look after himself and his sister. We meet Elise very early game as she appears to warn Cyan that he has a target on his back and prompts him to start his journey. Elise is a bit posh and is girly, but not in an annoying way. She has her quirks and is badass with a bow, but personality-wise is mostly forgettable.
Xantis joins a little later and is presented as an irresponsible, reckless rogue, but there is little to substantiate this persona, apart from the continuous reminder of his keen appetite for alcohol, which gets old fast. All in all, the characters are much more tolerable than the overly cutesy and eccentric characters that we often see in JRPGs. And before people start attacking me in the comments, I actually love JRPGs and I play a lot of them. Then there's the side characters who are bursting with personality.
So, should you play Trinity Trigger? If you are a fan of the Mana series and other similar games, then yes, no harm in giving it a go, especially since it's quite cheap. It's a fun game that doesn't demand as much of your time as other JRPGs, since you can complete the game in between 20 to 40 hours, depending on how much of a completionist you are.
Honestly, I really enjoyed Trinity Trigger, but I've played better. There are games out there with a better story, more memorable characters, superior combat systems, etc. But Trinity Trigger has enough great aspects to hold my attention and keep me entertained. The combat feels familiar, yet avoids being a rehash of what we've seen before, but there are some modern mechanics that could have been included to improve the overall experience, such as a monster taming element or a better map system.
Some dungeons can feel repetitive, especially since you have to revisit them for quests, sometimes several times. The towns have little to offer outside of the basic services you will find in every town. Trinity Trigger is a flawed gem that is a great throwback to the golden era of JRPGs. So let us know in the comments what you think about Trinity Trigger. I've been Craig.
And I've been Heather.
This is Amalgamingo, and thanks for watching.